Exchange's Fringe programme. This is, of course, the highlight of it, and we're delighted to be able to welcome you all here today. My name's Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. I'm proud of this event for a number of reasons, but the first of which is that I have the sole copy of Broken Heartlands here in this room. I'm delighted to be able to report, although I wanted us to have plenty of copies at the back, that it had already sold out today, such as the importance of the message which Seb Payne's path-breaking new book is imparting, and it will be available, I think now, in all good bookshops. I'm delighted to be able to welcome both of them here today, because both men are in that phrase which David Goodhart, our head of demography and integration, has banned from Policy Exchange. I am pressing the override button on him. Both men are thought leaders, and the cliche is actually appropriate unto both of them. Seb Payne, as all of you will know, is Whitehall editor of the FT. He's been one of the key journalists of our times on this great journey of his. Our fellow interlocutor here, Michael Gove, is of course our founding chairman of our trustees here at Policy Exchange, and is now apparently minister for almost everything, and we're delighted. We're thrilled to be able to welcome the day. They're going to turn over to questions from the audience. It's a brilliant audience. Many of the people who've been key figures in the Red Wall drama are here today. They will no doubt have many. So we have both thinkers, we have practitioners, and of course Michael was the spiritual influence behind us a few years ago. I can now reveal this to the audience here today for our hegemonic event in recent years here at this conference, Can the Conservatives Win in Canterbury and Middlesbrough at the same time? So it's a brilliant match. I'm sure you'll agree. It's a fantastic audience. As Stalin always used to say in the matter of arms procurement, eventually enough quantity becomes quality, and you impersonify that principle here today. So I welcome you all here. Seb, over to you. I think I should give you the baby to clutch. Thank you. Please give a big welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, Mikey, thank you for finding time to have a bit of a chat about this, and I am sorry that you've changed your glasses, otherwise this would have looked like a father-son family reunion event here. But I just want to go back and begin, because in the book we talk about a train journey, which remember when it was the Conservative Party election launch in 2019, and it was back, we were in the buffet car, and I was buying some little small bottles of red wine, and I heard this voice shouting, "Payne!" And it was half the cabinet, including Michael Gove, and it was just before the election. And I said to you, where should it look about what's going to fall first and no one's looking at? And you said Redcar, and I just laughed. Was that based on anything more than just a joke or gut instinct, or did you think it was actually something you'd seen there that we all hadn't at that point?
I wish that I could claim that I had mystic meg powers of prediction, and that I had a grasp of the local issues on the ground in Redcar, that I'd talked over a lemon, talked to every voter there, and I knew exactly that it was going to swing to the Conservatives. I didn't have that detailed knowledge, but what I did have were two things. A hunch, an instinct, and also the fruits of various conversations I'd had. The hunch and the instinct was that we were seeing a move, not just in the northeast of England, but in the North and Midlands, towards the Conservatives, that had been generated by the Brexit referendum in 2016, had its roots in events before that, gathered pace in the 2017 general election. We didn't really get the full impact of that because of a variety of factors in 2017, but it was ready to break in 2019. And while I didn't campaign much, sadly, to my regret, in the northeast in the 2019 election, the conversations that I did have in other seats, which are analogous, they're not identical to some of those that fell in the northeast, reinforced my sense that the traditional hold that Labour had had on communities, which was under strain, had been broken. And in particular, I felt that there were seats where I knew the candidates that we had were rooted in the community, energetic, and who would have seemed a genuine breath of fresh air. So even though I didn't know him at the time, Jacob, who was our candidate, is our candidate in Redcar, our MP, I knew was someone who was fighting incredibly hard on the ground. So it was that combination, as I say, of instinct, some of the conversations I'd had elsewhere, and knowing the great candidates that we did.
Now, what I try to examine in the book is how much of this is contingent on the factors of the 2019 elections.
Yes.
You've obviously had Brexit, Get Brexit Done, that slogan that appealed to Leavers and Remainers who wanted to simply just get this thing out of their lives. You also had Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and I think when we spoke at the end of the book, you said that by 17 to 19, the public had a much different sense of Corbyn. But I've obviously made the argument that it's structural and that we have seen a very big change in how England votes and how it looks at its politics. Do you agree with that view?
I totally agree with that view.
Good,
I think
I'm glad to hear.
I think you're right. There were some specific factors in 2019, but as we say, in 2017, people had less of a sense of who Jeremy Corbyn was, and the point that we discussed, I know, was that some of the things that were said about Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 just seemed incredible. So if you were inside the Beltway, you knew that he had been a supporter of Irish republicanism, that his views on security, on defence, on the Middle East, and the way in which that translated into his views about fighting anti-Semitism at home, and his views on the economy were just totally out of kilter with traditional Labour voters. But when people mentioned that in 2017, voters thought, that must be untrue. Nobody could be leader of the Labour Party and a possible Prime Minister, just years after Tony Blair was a Labour leader, and hold those views. By 2019, the evidence was there, the way in which he'd reacted, for example, to the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, the way in which he'd grotesquely mishandled the need to protect Jewish members of his own party, had meant that no one could escape how unsuitable he was. But I mentioned two other things as well. The thing is that the Labour Party that elected Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is the same Labour Party that elected Keir Starmer. Does that mean that the Labour Party has changed? Well, I'll leave that to others to decide if it has changed significantly. But one thing I will say is that the underlying problem, I think, that the Labour Party has is that it's no longer genuinely the party of working people. There are good people within it, but those who articulate a Labour message as it's been understood for generations, people like the firefighter Paul Embury, are strangers within that party. They're almost as isolated within that party now as Jeremy Corbyn was in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And if you look at the preoccupations of the Labour Party, and I think this is a point that Tony Blair brings out in your book, the preoccupations of the Labour Party are often set by pressure groups to whom they feel they have to pay attention. They're not entirely in hock to them, but it is the case that pressure groups on a variety of issues which are dear to the hearts of those in university common rooms and in low circulation newspaper editorial discussions, those ideas are front and centre in the thinking of far too many people in the Labour Party, and that has created a gulf and a distance. Now, it's possible for the Labour Party to recover, to reconnect, but last week it didn't seem to me to show any real desire and or willingness to do so. There wasn't the confrontation with some of the Labour Party's current preoccupations that one would have expected from a leader who was trying to change the party. So there wasn't that moment that you had in '85 with Neil Kinnock and that you had when Tony Blair said that they were going to change Clause 4, where you got the sense that there was an electric crackle in the room because he was taking on the people who'd held them back.
Well, just on that, I was in that room,
yes,
and you could see the visible confrontation with
yes,
the left, with people shouting about £15 minimum wage and all the rest of it. Now,
yeah,
I don't think it was a Labour leader scuffling round the city sort of moment, but he did take them on then. And when you were in that hall, it felt like Keir Starmer's Labour Party, not Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party.
I think that it's undoubtedly the case that Keir Starmer has sought to efface some of the memory of Jeremy Corbyn, and it is the case that some of the core Corbynite team are marginalised and unhappy. But it is also the case that you did not have the confrontation with identity politics that I think the Labour Party needs to have before it's going to move back into the mainstream, and which Tony Blair has talked about. And as I say, we don't get the sense, I don't get the sense that the Labour Party is serious about or in sympathy with the real concerns that the majority of working people have in the country. I think it's still, as I say, it's a party of academics and Guardian leader writers, not a party of engineers and toolmakers.
Well, I was going to add, Keir Starmer talked about toolmakers in his speech to some great extent.
Yes, and I think it was an attempt to acknowledge that the problem is there, an attempt to recognise the problem, but there wasn't anything that I think he said that showed that he appreciates the concerns, understands the values, or can articulate the ambitions of people who've broken away from the Labour Party. And so I think there's still a big underlying problem for Labour. I think the other part of the equation is also that the Conservative Party has changed. I do think that Boris Johnson leads a new government, and that new government is a government remade in the shadow of the Brexit referendum, and it is a government that appreciates, as I touched on very briefly earlier, and the Prime Minister has made clear, that the country wanted to move away from an economic model that had failed beforehand, and that economic model was one in which the fruits of growth were not equally shared, and the talents of all were not equally valued. We, I think, across the Conservative Party, appreciate the change that occurred in 2016 and understand the reasons why in a way that Labour, or certainly those who lead the Labour Party, don't. And you can see that in the way in which they return to the question, always trying to convince the country that the country got it wrong, and using anything in the news or any piece of even transitory evidence they can to try to suggest that it was a fundamental error and a fundamental mistake, rather than a clear sense that the majority of people in this country wanted things to change.
Now, that's very true about the economic model, and in the book Boris Johnson talks about ending a 40-year economic model, which of course is the time when Margaret Thatcher came to power. But there's also been some other people in power for the past 10 years, including yourself. You were in that government for 10 years. Is what you're doing now really an attempt to fix mistakes you made under the coalition and Theresa May government?
Well, I think that if you look back at the coalition years, I think that there were some mistakes we made. I think there were also some very, very good things that we did. But I think that there was a realisation, actually, post-2008, post the financial crash, that collectively this country had put too many eggs in one basket. That while the success of the City of London and of financial services will always be an area where the UK has a competitive advantage, you can't have a situation where the money that's generated in order to sustain the public services that will in turn make life safe and secure for all, and which in fact will be underpinning economic prosperity for all, you can't rely on the bottom third geographically of the United Kingdom to sustain that. That's not economically sustainable, and also it is fundamentally unjust. And I think that some of the things that happened between 2010 and 2015 were a powerful recognition of that. I think George Osborne's creation of the Northern Powerhouse, devolution of responsibility to mayors in the West Midlands and the North, and also, I would argue, some of the things that we were doing in education and challenging underperformance in parts of England outside London, were all driven by that. But I think that there were intimations and a recognition of that. But in particular, I think in the run-up to 2016, a recognition of those forces became inescapable.
Because obviously, you mentioned George Osborne there, who obviously cut local council budgets hugely in those austerity years. And when I went around a lot of the towns of England that have suffered from that, I've seen libraries closed, public services closed. In a way, wasn't the Brexit referendum and this new economic model that your government is trying to do a recognition of the fact that, those were the kind of mistakes made? You maybe shouldn't have cut as much or as quickly.
I think that it's always worth, when you look back, thinking about what the alternative or the counterfactual might have been. And I don't think that we could have laid the foundations for the resilience of our economy that has been exhibited in recent years if we hadn't had the degree of fiscal discipline that George brought to that office. But I think it is also the case that there were have been a number of forces at work. So if it is the case that local government is having to cut its coat quite finely because there's limited cloth, and you also have economic forces which mean that retail is moving away from the high street and online, and you also have a situation where civic institutions are having a tougher time, then you do have an effect on people's sense of belonging and local pride. And that has undoubtedly been the case. That I mentioned in a different conversation yesterday that while a lot of people who work in charity shops and chain stores have brought great goods to many more people at cheaper prices, if you have a high street that is chain stores, charity shops and voids, then you've lost something very special and very important. Local government has a critical role to play in helping to enhance the hearts of communities. That was behind the Towns Fund, and it lies behind some of the other things that we're going to be talking about in the Levelling Up white paper. So local government absolutely has a role to play, but I think it is also the case that we had to bear down on public spending overall, and we also, I think at the same time, embarked on reform in local government, which actually helped to generate the platform upon which people like Andy Street and Ben Houchen could make the difference that they have.
Now, there was this chap called Michael Gove who wrote an article in The Spectator in 2004 about why he was leaving journalism to become an MP, and you talked in that article about a democratic revolution across the UK, and you talked about police and crime commissioners and mayors. Do you want more mayors?
Yes.
When are they going to happen?
Well, we're going to have the Levelling Up white paper published in a few weeks' time. I think that the principle of strong, accountable local leadership works. And I think that you can have different models in different parts of the country. What is right for Greater Manchester is not necessarily going to be right for Somerset, by definition.
You could have county deals for that, for example.
Yes. Well, and one of the things that we're looking at is creating the circumstances in which, A, existing local leaders can do more, but B, more people will want to be local leaders. So...
Would you want them to be allowed to raise income tax, for example?
I wouldn't go that far yet.
Yet?
But I do think that if the West Midlands Combined Authority had not existed, I don't know, I haven't asked him, I don't think Andy Street would have necessarily gone into local government. Now that he has, you have the perfect platform and the perfect person for that platform coming together. And I think that for people who want to contribute to their community, they want to know that they can move the levers that make a difference. So I wouldn't necessarily go the whole hog and devolve income tax, but what I would ask as a prior question are, is it possible for someone to use whatever levers they have in order to attract business and enterprise into their community, and do they also have the levers alongside that to improve the public services for which they're responsible?
Now, your Secretary of State for Levelling Up, which I think was a fantastic idea. It's on page 364 of my book, actually, that says there should be a Secretary of State.
When Boris read the proofs, he immediately rang me up and said, look,
It's a great man. Now, obviously, the future of his government, and there's two MPs in the audience here, Paul Howell and Ian Levy, who were the first ever Tories, I think, for their seats in the northeast of England. Their whole future and this whole government rests on your shoulders. You've just given a speech on Levelling Up. When are you going to give us a bit more definition behind the stories and the slogans? Because at the moment, and I think Lord Heseltine has come out and said this, and says it is still a slogan without substance.
Yes, well, there are several things to say. The first thing is that in my speech I sought to draw a comparison with what Ben Houchen has been doing in Teesside and what we want to do more broadly. And the reason why I mentioned Ben, and I could have mentioned Andy Street, is that those are really existing examples of the four principles behind Levelling Up in action. And those four principles, which I mentioned in the speech and which we'll be talking about again and again and again, are first of all enhancing local leadership. And we touched on that, how you can give local leaders more power and get more people to become local leaders. The second part of it is about raising living standards. And it's here that we need to work in order to address the fundamental productivity problem that the UK has, and we might go on to talk about that in a moment, but we need specifically to work with local leaders and others to create the environment for the right sort of investment and the right sort of business formation in different parts of the United Kingdom. Because
you could cut corporation tax or business rates.
Well, we might come on to both of those, but we might not come on to the former, actually. We might come on to the latter. But in both cases, in all cases, you can't, I think, have successful levelling up without the private sector playing a critical role. And right from the very beginning, one of Ben's missions was recognising what had happened to the steel industry in Redcar to ensure that there would be sustainable jobs in the future. The third element is improving public services, particularly where they're weaker, and that goes to something that we've talked about for a long time, and again, the variability in quality of schools across the United Kingdom, and also some of the problems that we've had in getting technical and vocational education right are part of that. But so is crime, and so is public health. And then the final part of it is pride in place. And I think that the critical thing there is we've seen in different parts of the United Kingdom that culture and giving people the tools to put their town firmly on the map can help create the mix of ingredients which mean that there's a spring in the step of local people. Business finds it easier to locate there and to be part of a community which is on the up. And just to mention a couple of things, even though it's not in the north, but it is a neglected community in Thanet, in Kent. You have had culture playing a significant part in its revival, and then also in Bishop Auckland. Bishop Auckland is not a typical place, but it is a place that, again, has suffered in the past. A combination of a great local MP, Jonathan Ruffer, as a fantastic local philanthropist, the historic architecture and heritage, but also you have a festival like Kinren, which has been hugely successful in bringing people to Bishop Auckland and has put it on the map. All of those different ingredients are the sorts of things which reflect a community that's taken back control.
Now, all those things sound quite palpable. You can sort of see and feel when you live at a better pace. Are you going to have hard economic metrics for success of levelling up? So when you do your white paper, you could say, because, a community feeling nicer, the most important thing on the front of my book is the hanging basket there. And we know that Rachel Wolfe, who wrote the 2019 Tory manifesto, said hanging baskets are a key sign now of Tory voters and people living in pride of places they live. So as part of you going around the country putting hanging baskets everywhere, what is the success look like? Is it going to be numbers? Is it going to be more people voting Conservative? What is it?
Well, I think you can't have one single metric, so it's important that we are held to account and that we hold ourselves and others to account. So if a doctor is looking at a human body and he wants to know if an individual is healthy, there are lots of vital signs: heart rate, blood pressure, waist measurement. I don't do very well on the final one of those, but still. All of these are vital signs. So the vital signs, I think, are we improving productivity? That's the single most important thing.
Wages.
For wages to go up sustainably, and wages are going up for a number of very good reasons, but for that to be sustainable over time, you need to improve productivity overall. Because if you only have wage increases without productivity increases, then that feeds through into inflation. But it is possible, and Andy Haldane, who's joined the government as permanent secretary to look at levelling up, has made the point persuasively that we have a number of highly productive firms in the United Kingdom and then a long tail of lower productivity. That long tail of lower productivity is more marked outside London and the South East. There are exceptions to every rule, but one of the things that we need to do is, for example, to make sure that you have the clustering effect, the agglomeration effect that you see in London, but also in places like Cambridge, across the United Kingdom. It used to be the case that you had an agglomeration effect in Sheffield, that you had firms whose whole future was built around steel. Now that has gone. But what you can see are new agglomeration effects. You can see, again, in Teesside or in Newcastle, an opportunity for a combination of life sciences, renewables, and other tech firms, creating a virtuous circle. But again, one of the things that we do need to do is to ensure that all of those ingredients are in place. So productivity, as you say, more high-paying jobs, and also there are other metrics that we can use as well about the delivery of public services in those areas. More good and outstanding schools, and also, and so this takes longer, improved public health outcomes as well.
Now, just going back to tax for a moment, because you did
Yes.
mention, we talked about what levers could be pulled in particular places to encourage inward investment, because you mentioned the Teesside example. I'm not sure you can do Teesside everywhere, because Ben Houch has been very successful in spending a huge amount of public money, but you can't do that in every single part of the country. You've got to get more inward investment, and obviously you had the enterprise zones that were looked at in the 1980s and 1990s. Is that the kind of area you're looking at stuff?
It's already the case with free ports that you have that potential there.
So make the whole country a free port, really?
Well, the great thing, one day, but the great thing is that free ports both provide an opportunity for some visible benefits from being outside the European Union to be realised very quickly, having customs zones where you can have goods coming in, being processed, assembled, and then re-exported without all of the palaver that would have existed before and the costs. But it's also the case that there are changes that you make in stamp duty, land tax and other taxes which make free ports more attractive. But if you create a cluster around a free port, that has a beneficial effect. Again, to go back to Teesside, which is always a pleasure, if you have, as Ben will secure, at least 30,000 new high-paying jobs, then that means that on the high street in Stockton and Middlesbrough, you have individuals and families who are better able to ensure that ambitions are raised even further and living standards increase. So there are different tools that you can use in order to try to secure those benefits. But it's also the case that with the right set of policies, you can also make sure that people appreciate the quality of life factors that mean that living outside London and the South East is a much more attractive option. And it's striking that the government has relocated some top teams from the Treasury in Darlington. There was some scepticism from within government about whether or not if you moved the Treasury to Darlington, created this Treasury North campus, would you be able to attract, I won't name who made this argument, you won't be able to attract the type of people that we need in the Treasury. In fact, they've been inundated with applications. They've had more than 37 highly qualified people apply for every post, all from in and around the North East. And it seemed to me this was one of the most patronising assumptions that there had been beforehand, which was that it was somehow the case that the London and the South East had succeeded because that's where the talent was, and it's redressing that balance, and government can have certain anchor investments to redress that balance, which will make people who've been sniffy in the past realise that it's time to put their prejudices aside.
Now, another thing you could do to help boost the red wall is planning reform, which hopefully is also under your purview. Now, you've put this on pause, and I believe, and you've been talking to lots of MPs about what direction that's going to go. Now, the argument in the public debate is often about building over our green and pleasant land in the South East, and your colleagues in Surrey, Heath and around there don't want that. But the Red Wall MPs and those that I met, they want planning reform to be able to build things more quickly. So don't you just need to sort of just get on with that? Because, again, on all this, you haven't got that much time to the next election.
No, that's true. And normally, I'm not accused of being a hyper-cautious, laggardly, slow-moving, ultra-consensual minister. But I just need to take a little bit of time in order to make sure that we get the balance right. You are right that we do need to reform planning, but there are a number of different things that we need to do. The route to having more homes, more good homes, more affordable homes, is not simply through planning reform to increase supply. There are a range of other things that we need to do, and one of them is investing in regeneration. So there are brownfield sites where you need to invest initially to remediate the land. You need to get parcels of land together so you create a site of sufficient size. You need to make sure that there are the good employers there and thereabouts in order to make sure that it's a sustainable community. And then you can go gangbusters in terms of development. That's not to say that that process should be slow, quite the opposite, but it does mean that we shouldn't think of improving our planning system and improving the provision of housing simply through a single big bang approach.
But as a sort of on a point of principle, as a conservative, you know, you do want to make it easier to build. That still remains the key point of this.
Oh, we will. Well, we need more homes. We want more people to own their own homes. And there's a striking thing as well. I was talking to an academic last night. I'll have to check the facts before going pat on it. But he was showing me a graph that revealed something incredibly counterintuitive. I think most people in this room would know that if you manage to get a mortgage, and if you are a first-time buyer, I mean, you're already lucky in both of those cases, but once you're on the housing ladder, the amount that you will pay to pay off your mortgage at the moment is significantly less than you would pay in rent, which is, you know, cripplingly unfair. So now, you would automatically assume that the areas where the rent is proportionately higher than the cost of your mortgage would be in the south and southeast. It's not. The area where generation rent is suffering more is in Yorkshire and the Humber and in the northeast. Now, there are a variety of reasons for that, which I need to look more closely at. But actually, it shows that if you really, really want to help those who are currently in rented accommodation and want to own their own homes, then the focus shouldn't necessarily be geographically where it's been beforehand. Now, I should say that we also need to build more social housing, we need to build more retirement housing, we need to build more housing of every type of tenure so people can move more easily between them.
Should the government do that?
It should play a role in it, definitely. And that's why Homes England, the arm's-length body that was responsible for regeneration and working with housing associations, is so important. But ultimately, it is the private sector that is responsible for the provision of most housing in this country. It's the private sector that will be responsible for building more homes. And to be fair to those who are developers at the moment, they're clear that some of the incentives in the current system don't necessarily allow them to build where they would ideally like to build, and also don't necessarily incentivise them to build houses which are more beautiful and also more environmentally resilient.
I think you've just named there's a policy exchange report with that title.
Indeed.
Now, as I said, we've obviously been through the coronavirus pandemic. That's taken 2 years off your time to levelling up.
Yes.
What can you realistically do between now and the next election, assuming it's in 2024, and you've got 2 and a bit years to get to that? What do you want to achieve in that time? So you can then go back to the voters of Sedgefield and Blythe Valley and say, we've delivered on that trust, on what we promised you.
Well, I think that in a way, as I mentioned, we've already got pathfinders with the 2 Conservative mayors and the mayoral combined authorities that I mentioned earlier. And you can already see, and I mention them because they're real existing examples. So you can already see in Teesside that when Ben was elected as the mayor of the combined authority in Tees Valley, he did a couple of big things early on, including, for example, saying, right, I'm going to buy the airport. And what he was doing is saying, I am absolutely serious about using the powers I have for economic recovery. You can now see, 4 years on, the shift in the economic fortunes and the sense of confidence there. As it happens, you can also see, since Ben was first elected, Conservative MPs elected in Redcar, obviously beforehand in Middlesbrough South, but you also have a new Conservative MP in Stockton South, a new Conservative MP in Darlington, a new Conservative MP in Hartlepool, all as a result of the steps that have been taken there. Similar effect in the West Midlands. So I think what we need to do in other parts of England, and indeed other parts in the United Kingdom, is first of all show that there is investment from the centre that is going to local people and local communities so that they can deploy in accordance with their own priorities. And then people can see that the broader economic geography of the country is changing because we're creating the circumstances whereby there can be improved productivity. But you mentioned the hanging basket issue earlier, and people might think, is that trivial? Is that window dressing? Another analogy that I've used goes back to schools. One of the things that you see whenever an underperforming school is taken over by, say, a new academy trust is often the name is changed. And then it will often be the case that the uniform is changed. It will often be the case that you might have some changes that appear entirely superficial. So you create a house system where there wasn't beforehand. all of those things are a way of saying, we want to restore pride in this institution and this establishment. You're no longer an underperforming school, you're a school on a trajectory to success. And we're going to behave like that in the smartness of our uniform, in the approach that teachers take to punctuality and discipline and all of that. Now, that is a necessary but not a sufficient precondition for that school becoming good or outstanding. For it to become really good, you need to change deeper things. You might need to change some of the teachers. You certainly may need to change the teaching style or the curriculum. That'll take a little bit of time, but the two go together. So in the same way, if you give local communities the wherewithal, both the resources and also the chance to talk to others who've done it, to transform the urban environment and to show that they're serious about using the levers that they have in order to put the heart back into that community, that is one step. It's not enough on its own, but it can then make it easier to make the other deeper, longer-term economic transformations that you want to make. So I wouldn't scorn hanging baskets. There is a ground force element to levelling up. There is a Titchmarsh-Dimmock dynamic.
I don't ask who you are in that trio.
To levelling up. But it's not the whole story. And again, it's one of the things that I've observed in other government departments, that there's a natural desire for people to light on one aspect of what you're doing, but if what you're doing will bring about change overall, it's not always the eye-catching that tells the whole story.
Now, just on a lot of the Labour MPs I interviewed who lost their seats, they could give me a list as long as there's of all the things they did, about the projects they built, the hospitals they got, the roads they got, and they still lost their seats anyway. So might that happen to the Conservatives? Like, if you're just doing exactly what Labour said they did when they were in power, what's going to be the difference?
Well, I think that, again, it's making sure that you have the right combination. And yes, if you rely simply on marquee public sector investment, I mean, no one is going to scorn additional investment in a new hospital. That's a very good thing. But if all you're saying is, I'm a very effective advocate in getting public sector investment into this area without helping also to transform the underlying economic trends, then you don't have the beneficial dynamic that we want to see. And I think that one of the things that's been underplayed in some of the conversations about levelling up, but which Neil and Andy and I and the Prime Minister and Rishi are anxious to stress, is there has to be a key private sector, business, economic component to it as well. And part of that requires government to look at specific questions like access to finance. It's one of the points that's made in Paul Collier's book about the future of capitalism, that the decline of over generations of local banking and local finance network has meant that it's been more difficult for entrepreneurs and business startups outside London and the South East to get the finance, the patient finance that they need. So that is another part of what we need to do. But I certainly don't think that there is anything wrong in MPs championing big marquee projects in their community, but it's not enough on its own.
Now, I'm sure you don't want to give the Labour Party advice, but do you think there's any way they can win some of these back? And I also want to ask you about what Angela Rayner said at Labour Party conference last week, that at a reception she described the Tories as scum, as homophobic, as xenophobic and racist. What does that say to you about the state of politics and where Labour's at?
I like Angela Rayner, so I won't say anything unmannerly.
I feel like there's a but coming
about her. No, I absolutely won't. I think, in some respects, Angela Rayner is, if you consider the circumstances under which she's had to grow up and what she's achieved, then anyone can make a mistake. I'm sure she realises it was a mistake to say that at that time. On the broader point,
but what is that indicative of, though? That saying those things, and what if she does actually think that?
I think that she was, it was late at night and she was,
We all do funny things late at night.
I certainly know.
but just find
I hope I brought enjoyment to many.
Are you planning to level up more nightclubs across the country?
Exactly. No. I'm sure she regrets it, and it's one of those things. But more broadly, I think actually more revealing is not what any one individual says. More revealing are some of the deeper attitudes, right? So again, the Labour Party spent quite a lot of time debating stuff, which was very, it was almost sort of Titanium McGrath at some points, some of the stuff that they were obsessing about. And that just shows a divorce from where most people are and what their priorities are. If I were in the Labour Party, I would say that what they should do is they should replace the people around their leader. I'd replace the leader myself, but obviously, there you go. But I'd replace the people around the leader with those who have a genuine understanding of and attachment to working people. So I would say you need to have people...
Who do you rate in Labour?
Well, I mentioned Paul Embury earlier. I think even though he is an intellectual, that shouldn't be a bad word, but he's someone who's devoted his whole life to helping working people. Maurice Glassman. Some of the best people in Labour are sadly no longer in the party. People like John Woodcock and Ian Austin, Caroline Flint, Hazel Blears. There's a tradition, an admirable tradition, on broadly what might have been called the right of the Labour Party, which I think has been eclipsed. And if one thinks back to the difficult times that the Labour Party has had, it's often been those sorts of people who've kept it centred. And there are fewer and fewer of them, I think, identifiably around. I won't name many more of them because I would blight their career forever if I did.
Right, I think we've got time for some questions now. We've got some microphones. Let's go for the lady here. If you can just hop round to the back there. I hope no one's too warm doesn't pass out in here at the moment. There is water at the back, I think.
Hi, I'm Stella. I work for Crisis, the homelessness charity. You mentioned that one of the foundations of Levelling Up is pride in place. I wonder whether you also believe that this extends to a house for of one's own, and whether you agree that housing first, particularly those with complex needs such as poor mental and physical health and alcohol and drug addiction, is one of the most successful pilots that your government has funded, and whether you believe it should be expanded in England. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's you raise a number of important interrelated issues. The first thing is that your question gives me an opportunity to say how much I admire the work that my predecessor, Robert Jenrick, did in this area. And Robert was responsible through the Everybody In programme in making sure that we effectively, and it's never permanent, but we effectively eliminated to zero rough sleeping. And you're also right, you are the expert, but I certainly agree with you that if we're looking at homelessness, there are two factors. The first thing is, you simply need to make sure that there is a roof over someone's head, that they are safe and warm. But the factors that drive people onto the streets are multivariate, and it will often be the case that it's people who are suffering from poor mental health, people who may have a problem with substance abuse, people who may be ex-offenders, but also people who will suffer just a combination of catastrophic facts in their lives, which just lead them from security to being out on the streets and in desperate need. So we certainly do need to look at and maintain a focus on the housing component, but we also need to do everything from making sure that we're more effective when it comes to preparing people when they're in prison for life outside, and making sure that we have a more effective approach towards mental health, more effective drug and alcohol treatment. All of this comes together. And there's another thing as well, which, again, your organisation knows far more about than I do, which is hidden homelessness. Homelessness is not just a problem of people on the streets, it's also a problem of people living in cramped and inadequate accommodation, from those who are sofa surfing to those who are never able to get the home that they deserve. And unless we look at all of those factors, then the problem will continue. As I say, Robert did an amazing job with Chris Pincher and Eddie Hughes in addressing that. So it's a responsibility, tough responsibility on me to ensure that we don't let that progress slip.
Now, I wouldn't be much of a journalist. I have a very quick question here to Michael Crick.
Yes, Mr. Gove, there are 5 universities in Greater Manchester. Wouldn't one good way to level up, maybe a bit more long term, would be to establish new universities in places like Doncaster, Grimsby, Barrow, Thanet perhaps, and some of those other northern cities and towns that don't have them right now, because it generates economic activity, particularly if those universities concentrate on STEM subjects.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree.
There we are. There we are. Thanet University, here we come, everyone. Well, just stop. Well, on that, we might obviously.
Yes.
There is a big focus on vocational education at the moment, and skills plays a big part into levelling up. You know, what do you think about Tony Blair's famous half the country going to university? Was that a mistake? And do you think less people should go to university?
I don't think the ambition was a mistake. I don't think fewer people should go to university. But I do think it is the case that for a long period there has been a neglect of what is required in order to ensure that you have technical and vocational qualifications of sufficient rigour, which are also those which the employers want and need. And that's why I think that Michael's point is so important. You can have higher education institutions, you can call them universities. There's a difference between what some universities offer, which is attractive, but necessarily what's the word? Only perhaps suitable for, some, and what we should be concentrating on, which is precisely ensuring that people can have at least 3 years of high-quality technical and vocational education in scientific, engineering and mathematical subjects, which prepare them better for the world of work. Now, it may well be that the institution that you attend is called a college rather than a university, but if it's high quality, if you're particularly working closely with industry, and at the end of that you have a qualification that is deemed rigorous, then that seems to me to be absolutely the way in which we should think of going. In a way, it's not as though we're reinventing the wheel, it's not as though we're going back to polytechnics, but, one of the 5 universities that Michael mentioned, UMIST, was founded on the principle that you should do precisely that. And I think that if you look at other countries which have been both successful economically and also successful in terms of social mobility, people have been in education for longer, but the education hasn't necessarily been, I'm nothing against this, being in a seminar room discussing the hermeneutics of Spider-Man. It's been, looking at some of the more, directly scientifically rigorous routes into work.
Bad news for scholars of Spider-Man. Let's take 2 questions to try and get through some more. Can I get the chap at the back there and the lady here as well on the left? This lady here and then a chap behind you. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, my name's Jennifer Scotton from the BBC. I'm just wondering, with your levelling up agenda, it doesn't sound particularly cheap. Would you be happy for more taxes to be raised to pay for it?
Very good question. And the fellow at the back there, very quickly.
Paul Swinney from the Centre for Cities. You've given some advice to the Labour Party, a little bit more. Labour Mayor Andy Burnham wants to do a deal in terms of levelling up. Some in the Labour Party might balk at that. What would you say to the Labour Party around that?
Okay. On the first question, I don't think that it need be, and I think one of the things, again, going back to the very good point that Seb made earlier, is that if we want to have sustainable economic growth, then we need to recognise that taxes need to be at a competitive level. If you look at the example of, the Republic of Ireland, some of its economic transformation has been built, yes, on enlightened public policy. I'm talking, 2 or 3 decades ago, in terms of investment in education, but it's also the case that they managed to maintain a competitive tax and regulatory structure as well. That's now under threat as a result of their membership of the European Union. What we need to do is to make sure that we remain competitive overall in order to make sure that the private sector limb of levelling up is as strong as the public sector limb of levelling up. And on the point about a levelling up deal, I think that I won't personalise it, if Labour voters in any particular locality see someone who they have elected working with the government of whatever stripe in order to improve the lives of those who he or she represents, then that is a good thing. That people respect principle. They recognise that someone who's Labour is always going to have certain differences with someone who's Conservative. But it's also the case that if they can deliver, then that's a good thing. And, you know, I think that to move things on to a different perspective, one of the difficulties that I think the Scottish government has is that it's always looking to create a point of difference with the UK government rather than seeing where we can cooperate more effectively. And I think that that is having an increasingly negative effect on how they are perceived. Therefore, my advice to any political party in opposition is that the more mature your approach towards the government in power, the more likely people are to think that you are, you know, the sort of person who can be trusted with government.
Hope Nicola Sturgeon heard that. Just a quick one on cost of living, Michael. That obviously everyone's bracing for a bit of a cost of living crunch with inflation going up, fuel bills going up, food prices increasing. How's that going to play in these places that voted Conservative the first time? Because lots of them do sometimes tend to be, on average, a bit poorer and have lower quality public services than the rest of the country.
Yep. No, I think you're right, and I think. It's important not to be unduly pessimistic for a variety of reasons, but it's important to be realistic in terms of public policy. I'm not an economic expert, but I believe it is the case that there are certain pressures as a result of coming out of COVID globally that mean that the prices of raw materials in certain areas have risen and so on. It should be the case, all other things being equal, that this is something that can work through the economy's digestive system, as it were. But we have to be sensitive to the fact that for many working people, that the increases in fuel bills alongside increases in other prices places a particular pressure and strain. And that's why we need to, going back to our colleague from the BBC's question, make sure that we take the right approach on tax, but also make sure, exactly as the Prime Minister said, that we concentrate on helping to increase wages, helping to improve productivity, helping to get more people into work.
I think we've got time for a few more questions. I'm sorry to say I don't want any more journalists. I'm being biased here. So if we've got some vaguely normal people in the room, we'll take Rachel, straight ahead there. Where should we go for? Go for this gentleman here. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I count as normal, but thank you. I'm not going to defend hanging baskets. I was very interested in what you said about agglomeration. And if I understood it, agglomeration is sort of general city terms, but also sort of R&D cluster terms. And I was at an event earlier with the head of the FE College in Oldham, who is in a city that has agglomerated to a significant extent and has done very well. But in Oldham, people still leave. And it has not risen to the same extent with the tide. And I just want to understand a bit better what your approach would be to places like Oldham and towns, if your main productivity approach, if I understand it, is about agglomeration in cities.
There's a brilliant question.
Yes, obviously, yes.
I think there are two things. The first thing is that Oldham itself can't succeed unless Manchester succeeds. And I think we need to recognise that it's wrong to pit the future of towns against the success of cities. So, again, in the same way, and Ian will correct me if I'm wrong, if Newcastle is succeeding, then Blyth, Cramlington, Ashington, Gateshead, are more likely to succeed as well. But one of the reasons why you may have problems in Ashington or in Oldham will often be as basic but important as transport links. Is it the case that you can move quickly from home in Oldham and school in Oldham to other parts of the broader economic geography of which you're part? But the second thing also is, what about the institutions that you have there? I know that the principal of the FE College that you're referring to is outstanding, but the broader educational infrastructure in Oldham, not so good. And then the other thing as well is also in Oldham, you have a legacy both of poor housing in some parts, but also of community tensions that require to be addressed as well. So it's not sufficient to say the rising tide of Manchester will lift all of the boats in Greater Manchester and around it, but it is important to look and have specific solutions for what is happening in each of those towns. And I would want to, and it's part of my mission to, better understand which towns around Manchester are succeeding and why. And at the risk of entering into territory where I really am only tiptoeing, it seems to me that there are things that are happening in Wigan which are working, which are not happening in Oldham yet. That has to be part of the answer. But another part of the answer is looking at what local leadership has been like in Oldham and why it is that it hasn't received the attention that it should have done. Final thing that I was going to say is I'd also want to, as well as asking questions about education in Oldham, I'd also want to ask some questions about crime and the quality of public spaces in Oldham as well. Because I only touched on crime very briefly earlier, but it is one of the biggest problems in creating the circumstances where people can feel a degree of pride in their city, and also where you can have the meaningful interactions that mean that life is good. If parks are unkempt and dangerous, if high streets after 6 o'clock are places where women fear to go, that is a big problem. And final thing I was going to say is to make reference to someone I haven't yet met, but I'm very anxious to meet, Tiger Patel, the recently elected Conservative councillor in Blackburn. Yeah. Now, hands up those of you who've seen Tiger's election broadcast. Okay. I urge you all to. He doesn't say a word for most of it. He walks through a park in Blackburn. You've got graffiti, you've got swings which children can't use. It's a mess. And the point that he is making is, the person who's been your councillor, who's supposed to look after this, it's a park, you know, it's not rocket science, has just let you down. The kids can't play, it's disgusting, all the rest of it. And Tiger says, I'm going to change it. He was elected in Blackburn, and since then, what Tiger has been doing is also himself making films about him clearing the rubbish off the street, which the council won't, and getting the local Conservative team to do it. Now, we can't all be Tiger, but the one thing that he completely understands is the part of Blackburn that he represents is not going to get its pride back until there is someone who says, get that graffiti off, get those swings working, get that rubbish off the street, and if nobody else will, I will. And that's why, even though I haven't yet met him, he's one of my heroes.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We've just run out of time, and I'm going to take Chair's prerogative. That's one last tiny quick question before we have to head off. When you look at the Red Wall, Michael, and obviously through all the people I've met when I was writing the book and going around these places, if you could say one thing directly to them, because there was a poll out in the Times today that showed Labour's ahead in the Red Wall, and a lot of those voters are floating back towards Labour, what would you say to them now to say that the Conservative Party is still the right vote for them?
Judge us by our actions over the next 2 years.
There we are. Very straightforward. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. Please, a round of applause for Michael Gove.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to say as well, buy the book. There aren't any at this conference because they've sold out, but on Amazon, your local independent bookshop as well, you can get them as well. And I hope you enjoy it, and thank you all very much for coming.